May 2014. The Kjellberg farm, 6 miles south of Viroqua in Vernon County, Wisconsin. The morning is cool. The temperature is 51 degrees. A 49-year-old woman named Astrid Kjellberg is standing at the southwest corner of her main pasture with her 14-year-old son Anders at her side. They are watching a flock of 42 Embden geese moving through the grass at the eastern edge of the field. Beyond the geese, in the wooded paddock that connects to the pasture through a wooden gate, 28 Tamworth and Berkshire pigs are rooting through the leaf litter under a stand of oak and hickory. The pigs and the geese have shared this property continuously since April of 2011. They have been the only commercial integrated pig and goose operation in Vernon County for the past 3 years. 2 miles north of the Kjellberg property, on the Hutchins farm, a 56-year-old conventional pork producer named Dale Hutchins is standing in an empty confinement barn. The barn had contained, on the morning of April 14, 2014, approximately 2,200 Yorkshire pigs in commercial production. By the morning of May 6, 2014, 21 days later, the barn contains 491 surviving pigs. Dale Hutchins has lost approximately 1,700 animals to porcine epidemic diarrhea virus in 3 weeks. The financial loss, at the depressed pork prices of spring 2014, is approximately $340,000. He is the 14th conventional pork producer in Vernon County to be devastated by the PEDV outbreak that has been moving through the driftless area since March. Astrid Kjellberg has lost no pigs. Not one. Astrid Kjellberg has not lost a pig to disease in 3 years of operation. The geese, which the community of Vernon County had spent 3 years laughing at her for keeping in the same pasture rotation as the pigs, were now the only reason the Kjellberg pig operation existed in May of 2014, when 14 of the largest commercial pork operations in the county had been reduced to fractions of their pre-outbreak inventory. But this story does not begin in May of 2014. This story begins 3 years earlier, on the morning of February 22, 2011, when Astrid Kjellberg walked into the kitchen of her farmhouse, found that her husband Glenn Bauer had left during the night, found the note he had left on the kitchen table next to a half-empty coffee cup, and read the 4 sentences he had written. Astrid, I cannot do this anymore. The farm is breaking us. I have gone to Madison. Do not look for me. The note was signed simply, Glenn. Astrid was 46 years old that morning. She had been married to Glenn Bauer for 18 years. She had 2 sons. Henrik was 17, Anders was 11. The farm was the 142-acre property that Astrid had inherited from her father, Olaf Kjellberg, in 2003, when Olaf had died of a stroke at age 73. Olaf had been a dairy farmer, so had Olaf's father Sven Kjellberg, who had purchased the property in 1948 with savings from 12 years of farm labor in Wisconsin and Minnesota. The Kjellberg family had run dairy on the property continuously from 1948 to 2003. Astrid had converted the dairy to a small commercial pork operation in 2004 because the milk prices had collapsed in the late 1990s and because she had not been able to make the dairy mathematics work after she had inherited it. Glenn had been the operational manager of the pork conversion from 2004 to 2011. Glenn had not been a competent operational manager. He had drunk steadily for 14 of the 18 years of the marriage. He had borrowed money from the Kjellberg savings account without telling Astrid through most of those 14 years. He had run the pork operation at consistent losses that he had concealed from Astrid by selectively reporting the financial outcomes. Astrid had discovered the pattern of concealment in November of 2010, 3 months before Glenn left. She had confronted Glenn at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in early December. Glenn had not denied anything. He had told her, in the dim light of the kerosene lamp, that he had been waiting for years for her to discover the pattern, and that he had been planning to leave whether she discovered it or not. He had told her that he had run out of capacity to continue pretending. She had asked him to leave the farm immediately. He had asked for 2 months to make arrangements. He had used the 2 months to clear out the savings account she had not yet checked, which had been her grandmother Bertha's emergency fund from 1958, and which had contained, on December 6, 2010, approximately $11,000. By the morning of February 22, 2011, the savings account contained $27.42. The Kjellberg farm contained 142 acres of land, 4 old farm buildings, an aging dairy parlour that had been mostly empty since 2004, a small pork operation that ran approximately 160 Yorkshire pigs in conventional pens, an operating loan of $47,000 that Glenn had taken out in 2008 against the property, and 7 days of feed inventory. Astrid sat at the kitchen table that morning for an hour and 40 minutes after reading Glenn's note. She did not cry. She did not call anyone. She drank the cold coffee Glenn had left in the kitchen. She made a list, on the back of an envelope, of the things she needed to do that day. The list had 11 items. The first item was to wake Henrik and Anders and tell them what had happened. The second item was to drive into Viroqua and meet with the operations director at Organic Valley headquarters, where Astrid had been working part-time in the accounting office since 2007. The third item was to call her mother, Bertha, who was 73 years old and who lived in a small apartment in Stoughton, Wisconsin, 2 hours east of the Kjellberg farm. The 4th through 11th items were operational details about the pig operation that Astrid had been carrying in her head for 8 years, while Glenn had been mismanaging it. Astrid completed the 11 items by 9 in the evening. She slept for 4 hours that night. She woke at 3:30 in the morning of February 23rd. She walked out to the dairy parlour in the dark with a flashlight. She stood in the empty milking stalls for 20 minutes. She walked back to the house. She made breakfast for Henrik and Anders. She drove them to school. She drove to Viroqua. She walked into the Organic Valley office at 8 in the morning. She told her supervisor, a 52-year-old woman named Margaret Eikens, that she was resigning. Margaret asked her what she would do instead. Astrid told her she would be running the family farm full-time. Margaret asked her what kind of operation. Astrid said, "Pigs and geese." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. She did not laugh. She nodded slowly. She asked Astrid to sit down. The two women talked for 90 minutes. Margaret Eikens had grown up on a small dairy farm outside of Westby. Her grandmother had kept a small flock of geese alongside the family pigs throughout the 1940s and 1950s. Margaret remembered the geese clearly. She remembered the small, noisy birds that her grandmother had insisted were necessary, even though Margaret's grandfather had complained about them constantly. Margaret had been 6 years old when her grandfather had finally won the argument in 1958, and her grandmother had been forced to sell the geese to a neighbour. Margaret's grandmother had cried for 3 days. Margaret had not understood why at the time. She understood now. Astrid Kjellberg had been planning the integrated pig and goose operation since the summer of 2009. She had been planning it in private. She had not told Glenn. She had not told anyone. She had been keeping a small black notebook in the bottom drawer of her bedroom dresser, beneath a stack of folded sheets her mother Bertha had given her in 1994 as a wedding gift, where she had been documenting the system her mother's family had operated in Denmark before emigrating to Wisconsin in 1956. Bertha Kjellberg had been born in 1937 in the small village of Hjortlund in central Jutland, Denmark. Her father, Niels Brorsen, had been a small farmer who had kept pigs and geese together on his 37-hectare property continuously from 1934 to 1956. The Brorsen family had emigrated to the United States in October of 1956, when Bertha had been 19. Bertha had married Olaf Kjellberg in 1962. She had carried, across the entire period of her American life, the memory of her father's small Danish integrated operation. She had described it to her daughter Astrid across the years of Astrid's childhood and adolescence in the way that immigrants describe the small, specific practices of the lives they left behind. Astrid had remembered. Astrid had begun in the summer of 2009, when she had been 44 years old, and when she had finally understood that the Glen-managed pork operation was not going to survive another 5 years, to take the descriptions her mother had given her and to research what the published agricultural science said about integrated pig and waterfowl systems. She had found, in the LSU and Iowa State and Wisconsin Extension publications, that the system her grandfather Niels Bråsen had used in Jutland had been documented continuously in Northern European agricultural literature since approximately 1850. The system had multiple documented benefits. The geese consumed the short grass forage that the pigs did not eat, which improved pasture utilization. The geese alerted to predators and to unauthorized human approach, which reduced losses. The combined manure complementarity created soil conditions superior to either single species operation. The geese laid eggs and produced down and meat as secondary revenue streams. The biggest documented benefit, however, was the disease interruption. Geese in pasture rotation with pigs disrupted the parasite cycles that affected conventional pork operations. The geese broke the transmission patterns of internal parasites by consuming the intermediate host species. The geese also disrupted, the European literature suggested, but did not yet fully demonstrate, several viral transmission patterns that conventional pork operations were vulnerable to. The published research was, in 2009, suggestive rather than conclusive on the viral disruption mechanism. Astrid had read everything she could find. She had filled the small black notebook with summaries of the research and with the technical specifications she would need to convert the Kjellberg property from conventional confinement pork to integrated pasture-based pig and goose. She had been preparing the conversion plan for 19 months by the time Glen left on February 22, 2011. She had not told Glen because she had understood, from approximately 2008 onward, that Glen would not support the conversion and would actively sabotage it. She had been waiting, although she had not consciously framed it as waiting, for the moment when Glen would leave on his own initiative. The moment had arrived. Astrid drove from the Organic Valley office to her mother Beerta's apartment in Stoughton on the afternoon of February 23, 2011. The drive was 2 hours. She arrived at 4 in the afternoon. Beerta was 73 years old. Beerta had been showing signs of mild cognitive decline since 2009, but had been managing independently in the small apartment that Astrid had helped her move into after Olaf's death. Beerta made coffee. Astrid told her mother that Glen had left. Beerta listened. She did not respond immediately. Astrid then told her mother what she had been planning to do with the farm. Beerta set down her coffee cup. Astrid. Yes, Mama. Pigs and geese. Yes. Like your grandfather Niels. Yes. Like Jutland. Yes. Beerta was quiet for a long moment. Then she began to cry. The crying lasted approximately 4 minutes. Astrid had not seen her mother cry since Olaf's funeral in 2003. Beerta had carried the memory of her father's Danish farm for 55 years without ever expecting any member of her American family to attempt to recreate it. Beerta had assumed that the memory would die with her. She had not framed this as a tragedy. She had simply accepted it. The discovery, at age 73, that her daughter had been quietly planning for 19 months to recreate the Bråsen system in the Wisconsin driftless area was the most emotionally consequential event Beerta Kjellberg had experienced since the day in October of 1956 when her family had boarded the ship in Copenhagen for the United States. Beerta and Astrid talked for 6 hours at the kitchen table in the Stoughton apartment. Beerta described the Bråsen farm in detail Astrid had not previously heard. She described the layout of the pasture rotation that her father had used. She described the specific breeds of geese her father had preferred. She described the timing of the breeding cycles that her father had coordinated between the species. She described what her father had told her when she was 12 years old in 1949, about why he kept the geese with the pigs, even though his neighbors thought the practice was old-fashioned and unnecessary. Bertha wrote, that evening, 12 pages of handwritten notes in the small black notebook Astrid had been keeping. The notes were in Danish, in the formal handwriting Bertha had learned at the Hjortlund village school in the 1940s. Astrid drove home to Vernon County the following morning with the notebook. Glenn Bauer had been 35 years old when Astrid had married him in 1993. He had been the youngest son of a Brown County dairy family that had lost their farm to bankruptcy in 1988. Glenn had been 20 in 1988. He had watched his father, who was 46, leave the family farm for the last time on a Wednesday morning in October, drive to a small motel outside of Green Bay, and not return for 4 days. The family had been forced to sell the property at distress prices the following spring. Glenn had carried, from that period, a permanent set of psychological responses to the conditions of working farms. He had developed a particular fear of agricultural debt that he had compensated for by accumulating it. He had developed a particular fear of risk that he had compensated for by avoidance. He had developed a particular fear of his own inadequacy that he had compensated for by drinking. Astrid had known the family history when she married him. She had believed in 1993, at age 28, that her own steadiness would compensate for what Glenn carried. She had been wrong. The steadiness had not been enough. Glenn had absorbed the steadiness without changing his own patterns. The marriage had been the slow 18-year demonstration of the limit of what one person's steadiness could accomplish in the absence of the other person's willingness to be changed by it. Astrid had finally understood the limit in November 2010, 3 months before Glenn left, when she had discovered the pattern of financial concealment. She had not, in those 3 months, told Glenn she had understood. She had simply waited. The waiting had ended on February 22, 2011. The waiting had been, in some way, that Astrid would not be able to articulate clearly for another decade, the longest sustained act of patience she had performed in her adult life. The decision to convert the farm to integrated pig and goose operation in March of 2011 had been, in a different way, the longest sustained act of preparation she had performed. The two acts had run in parallel from 2009 to 2011. The preparation had been waiting for the moment when the patience could end. The moment had arrived. The work had begun. Bertha Kjellberg, in her small Stoughton apartment, on the afternoon of February 23, 2011, when Astrid arrived to tell her about Glenn's departure and about the conversion plan, had been carrying her own internal version of the same patient preparation. She had not, in the 55 years since emigrating from Denmark in October 1956, ever expected to see the Bråsen farming system recreated in the United States. She had described it to Astrid throughout Astrid's childhood as a kind of nostalgic family law. She had not framed it as a transferable practice. Her own decision to emigrate in 1956 had been driven by economic necessity rather than by any positive vision of what American agriculture might offer her. She had married Olaf Kjellberg in 1962, in part because Olaf was a Wisconsin dairy farmer, and dairy work was the closest equivalent to her family's small operation in Hjortlund. She had spent 41 years on Olaf's dairy farm, watching the small, specific practices of her father's operation gradually fade from her active memory. She had not, by the time Olaf died in 2003, expected to do anything further with the memory. The memory was about to die with her, the way most immigrant memories died, in the slow attrition of decades. The morning of February 23, 2011, had changed this. The discovery, at age 73, that her daughter had been quietly building the conversion plan for 19 months had restored something Bertha had assumed was permanently lost. Bertha had cried for 4 minutes at the kitchen table. The crying had been, although Bertha would not have used the word, the public recognition of a private grief that had been carried for 55 years. The grief was the grief of an immigrant who had assumed that the carrying was futile. The discovery that the carrying had not been futile was the equivalent of the discovery, in archaeological terms, that an artifact one had assumed to be lost had been preserved underground for centuries. Berth spent the following 6 hours at the kitchen table, giving Astrid every operational detail she could remember. She gave timing of breeding cycles. She gave specific feed ratios her father had used. She gave the names of the 4 neighbouring farms in Hjortlund that had run similar systems through the 1940s and that had cooperated with Niels Brorsen on the breeding stock rotations. She gave the names of the 2 specific goose bloodlines her father had preferred. She gave the calculation Niels had used for determining the optimal ratio of pigs to geese for a given pasture size, which was approximately 1 pig per 2 geese for the kind of mixed pasture that the driftless area would offer. She gave the names of the 3 German neighbours who had immigrated to Wisconsin in the 1950s from the same region of Denmark, 2 of whom were dead by 2011, and one of whom was an 81-year-old woman named Greta Borgersen, who lived in a nursing home outside of Madison, and whose family had operated a similar system in the same Hjortlund region. Bertha insisted that Astrid contact Greta Borgersen. Astrid drove to the nursing home outside of Madison on the morning of March 8, 2011, 2 weeks after Glenn had left. She found Greta Borgersen in the common room of the nursing home. Greta was small. She was very alert. She remembered Hjortlund clearly. She remembered, when Astrid introduced herself as Bertha Vernon Kjellberg's daughter, that she had known Astrid's mother since the 2 of them had been small girls. Greta and Astrid talked for 3 hours. Greta described the Borgersen operation in the same period that the Brorsen operation had been running. The 2 systems had been roughly identical in technique, with small variations that Greta described in patient, careful detail. Greta gave Astrid the contact information for her son Erik Borgersen, who was 54 in 2011 and who operated a small organic farm outside of Mineral Point, approximately 90 miles southeast of Vernon County. Greta said that Erik had been keeping a small flock of Embden geese alongside his Tamworth pigs since 1998. Erik had not been operating commercially. He had been operating, the way Greta described it, in the way her father had operated, which was for family subsistence and for the preservation of the technique. Astrid called Erik Borgersen on the evening of March 9, 2011. Erik agreed to meet with her. He drove to Vernon County on the weekend of March 19th. He walked the Kjellberg pastures with Astrid for 2 full days. He described his own operation in technical detail. He gave Astrid the contact information for the Wausau Heritage Breed Farm that had supplied his original goose stock, and that would, 3 weeks later, supply Astrid with her foundation, 18 goslings. The connection between the Brorsen family and the Borgersen family, which had been continuous in Hjortlund through the 1940s and which had been interrupted by the emigration of both families to the United States in the 1950s, had been quietly preserved across 2 American generations in the Borgersen family, even though the families had lost contact. The connection was now being reactivated through Astrid and Erik. Erik became, across the years between 2011 and 2025, one of 2 people outside Astrid's immediate family with whom Astrid corresponded regularly about the operational details of the system. The other was an extension agent at the University of Wisconsin-Madison named Dr. Hannah Vorland, who would become involved with the Kjellberg operation in 2016 after the PEDV outbreak had made the system regionally visible. The conversion of the Kjellberg property to integrated pig and goose operation began on March 4, 2011. Astrid sold 78 of the conventional Yorkshire pigs at distress prices to generate immediate cash. She used the cash to purchase 18 Embden goose goslings from a heritage breed farm outside of Wausau and 12 Tamworth pig piglets from a small breeder near Spring Green. The Tamworth was an Old English breed adapted to pasture-based outdoor production, in contrast to the Yorkshire confinement breeds Glenn had been running. The conversion would take 3 years. The remaining 82 conventional Yorkshire pigs would be sold gradually across 2011 and 2012 as the Tamworth Berkshire Foundation herd was built up. The Embden goose flock would be expanded from 18 to approximately 45 birds across the same period. The community of Vernon County noticed the conversion within 6 weeks. The first sign of community notice was the conversation that Astrid's neighbor, Wendell Mickelson, a 67-year-old conventional dairy farmer who owned the property directly north of the Kjellberg place, had with Astrid at the post office in Viroqua on a Monday afternoon in late April 2011. Wendell was retrieving his mail. Astrid was retrieving hers. The two of them met in the lobby. Astrid. Wendell. I heard you sold most of the Yorkshires. I did. And you bought geese. 18 of them. He nodded. He was a careful man. He had been a friend of Astrid's father, Olaf, for 40 years. Astrid. Yes, Wendell. Geese do not go with pigs. Wendell. Yes. My grandfather kept them together in Denmark for 22 years. So did his father. So did most of the small farmers in central Jutland through the entire 19th century. The combination works. Wendell. Yes, Astrid. Your grandfather was in Denmark. Yes, you are in Wisconsin. The same principles apply. Wendell looked at her for a long moment. He had known Astrid since she was a baby. He had been at her wedding. He had liked Glenn at first and had grown to dislike him over the years. He had been one of the 4 neighbors who had silently watched the Glenn-managed pork operation lose money for 8 years without saying anything to Astrid about it. He understood. Standing in the post office lobby on a Monday afternoon in April 2011, that he had not done his job as a neighbor across those 8 years, and that the woman standing in front of him had been carrying alone what should have been a community problem. He did not say any of this. He simply said, Astrid, if you need help with the work, call me. Astrid thanked him. She drove home. She did not call him. She did not need to. The story of the Kjellberg geese traveled across Vernon County within the following month, in the way that stories traveled in small Wisconsin farming communities in the early 2010s, which was through the post office bulletin boards, the church suppers at Holy Trinity Lutheran in Viroqua and at St. Mary's Catholic in Cashton, the morning coffee at Driftless Cafe on Main Street, and the slow, careful Saturday morning visits that older farmers made to each other across the region. The story took the shape that stories of unconventional decisions always took in those communities. The Kjellberg woman lost her husband, and she is running the farm into the ground. The Kjellberg woman is keeping geese in the same pasture as the pigs. The Kjellberg woman is going to lose what little she has left within 2 years, and then the place will be auctioned, and the Hutchins family will buy it, because Dale Hutchins has been wanting that property for 15 years. The story circulated through the spring and summer of 2011. It intensified at the Vernon County Community Agricultural Fair on the 3rd weekend of August. The Vernon County Community Agricultural Fair had been operating since 1923. It was held annually at the Vernon County Fairgrounds in Viroqua. It was the central social event of the year for the regional farming community. It included a livestock pavilion, a 4-H pavilion, a crafts hall, a tractor pull, and a small commercial exhibition area where local producers could display their operations. Astrid had decided in early August 2011 that she would enter a display at the fair. She had decided this not because she expected community recognition, but because she had calculated that the fair would be the most efficient single venue for explaining her system to neighbors who would otherwise hear only the dismissive second-hand version of the story. She set up a small display in the commercial exhibition hall on Friday morning, August 19th, 2011. She had brought 4 Tamworth piglets in a portable wooden pen. She had brought 6 Embden goslings in a separate pen beside the piglets. She had hung a hand-painted wooden sign that read, Kjellberg Integrated Pasture Operation, Pigs and Geese, established 2011, tradition since 1934. She had stood behind the display from 9 in the morning until 8 in the evening on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. The reaction of the fair attendees was uniform across the 3 days. The morning attendees were older farmers who walked through the commercial exhibition hall as routine. They stopped at the display. They looked at the piglets. They looked at the goslings. They read the sign. Some of them recognized Astrid. Most of them shook their heads. A few of them said something dismissive to a companion as they walked away. The afternoon attendees were younger families with children. The children loved the goslings. The adults pulled their children away from the pen after brief glances. The evening attendees were the community establishment. They included Dale Hutchins, the 53-year-old conventional pork producer from the farm 2 miles north of the Kjellberg place, who would, in 3 years, become the public face of the PEDV catastrophe in Vernon County. Dale Hutchins stopped at the display on Saturday evening at approximately 7:30. He was carrying a beer in a plastic cup. He was with 3 other men, all of them conventional commercial pork producers from the region. They stood in front of Astrid's display for approximately 4 minutes. They looked at the piglets. They looked at the goslings. They looked at the sign. They looked at Astrid. Dale Hutchins finally said, loud enough to be heard across the exhibition hall, "Astrid, are you serious about this?" "I am serious, Dale." "Pigs and geese?" "Yes." "In the same pasture?" "Yes." Dale looked at his companions. The 3 of them began to laugh. The laughter was loud. It traveled across the exhibition hall. Other attendees turned to look. The laughter continued for approximately 15 seconds. Then Dale said, again loud enough to be heard by the surrounding crowd, "Astrid, when you give up on this, I will buy the property at fair market value, save you the trouble of going through foreclosure." The 4 men laughed again. They walked away from the display. They walked toward the beer tent. Astrid did not move. She did not respond. She stood behind the display with her hands resting calmly on the wooden pen rails. Henrik, who was 17 and who had been standing next to her, started to say something. Astrid put her hand on his arm. "Henrik." "Yes, Mom. Not today. Not in this moment. The work will speak." Henrik was quiet. He nodded. He stood next to his mother for another 2 hours until the fair closed for the night. Anders, who was 11, had been at the 4-H pavilion with friends. He arrived at the commercial exhibition hall at 8:15. He saw his mother and his brother standing behind the display. He did not know what had happened. He sensed only that something had happened. He took his place beside Henrik. The 3 of them packed up the display together at 8:30 when the fair closed for the night. The 3 days of the fair concluded on Sunday evening. Astrid had received 0 serious inquiries from other producers. She had received 12 casual conversations from people who wanted to look at the goslings and ask what they were. She had not made any sales. She had not collected any business cards. The display had been, in conventional metrics, a failure. The display had, however, accomplished what Astrid had needed it to accomplish. Every farmer in Vernon County now knew what she was doing. The story would no longer require second-hand explanation. The story would carry itself. The community of Vernon County, across the autumn of 2011 and through 2012 and into 2013, continued to dismiss the Kjellberg integrated operation. The dismissal had a settled quality. The community had decided. The community had no need to revisit the decision. The Kjellberg woman was running her farm in an old-fashioned European way that did not match modern American commercial standards. The Kjellberg woman would not last more than another 3 years. The Hutchins family would acquire the property when the inevitable foreclosure occurred. The community had nothing further to say about it. Astrid continued the work. She did the work with Henrik and Anders. Henrik turned 18 in October 2011 and made the decision to defer college enrollment for 2 years to work the farm with his mother. He had been accepted at the University of Wisconsin River Falls for the agriculture program. He had a deferred enrollment plan that would allow him to start in autumn 2013. Anders was 12 in 2012 and worked the farm in the after-school hours and on weekends. He took particular responsibility for the goose flock, which he had named individually, and whose breeding cycles he tracked in a separate notebook he kept in his bedroom. Birte Kjellberg visited the farm 3 times in 2011 and 4 times in 2012. She rode with Astrid to the farm from Stoughton on Saturday mornings and returned on Sunday afternoons. Each visit, she walked the pastures with Astrid and Henrik and Anders. She offered specific recommendations from her memory of her father Niels Brorson's operation. She corrected small mistakes in the pasture rotation timing. She demonstrated the correct grip for holding a young goose during health inspection. She told stories about Hjortlund. She told the boys about their great-grandfather Niels, who had died in 1971 in Denmark, 10 years after his daughter had emigrated to Wisconsin. By the autumn of 2013, the Kjellberg integrated operation had stabilized. The Tamworth and Berkshire pig herd numbered approximately 32 animals, all pasture-raised in rotational paddocks across 40 acres of the property. The Embden goose flock numbered 45 birds across 2 breeding groups. The operation was generating approximately $38,000 in annual gross revenue from direct sales of pasture pork and goose products to a small network of approximately 20 regular customers in the Madison and Milwaukee metropolitan areas who had been finding Astrid through word of mouth in the local food community. The operation was clearing approximately $14,000 in net annual income after operating costs. The income was not, in 2013, sufficient to fully replace the income Astrid had earned at Organic Valley before her resignation in February 2011. The deficit had been covered by the slow drawdown of the small inheritance Astrid's father, Olaf, had left her in 2003, plus Henrik's contribution from a part-time job at a small grocery store in Viroqua, plus careful management of household expenses by Astrid. The Kjellberg family had not, in 3 years, gone hungry. They had not, in 3 years, missed a mortgage payment on the operating loan that Glenn had taken out in 2008. They had not, in 3 years, asked the community for help. The porcine epidemic diarrhea virus arrived in Vernon County in the 2nd week of March 2014. The first reported case was at a confinement operation outside of Westby on March 9th. The second case was at a confinement operation near Cashton on March 14th. By March 28th, 6 different conventional pork operations in Vernon County had reported PEDV outbreaks. By April 15th, the count had grown to 11 operations. By May 1st, 14 operations. The cumulative pig losses across Vernon County by May 6, 2014 were approximately 17,000 animals. The financial losses were estimated by the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture at approximately $3.4 million across the affected operations. PEDV had a mortality rate among pre-weaning piglets of approximately 95%. The virus spread through fecal-oral transmission. Conventional confinement operations were particularly vulnerable because of the high pig densities and the concentrated manure handling systems that created ideal transmission environments. The Kjellberg integrated pasture operation, with its low pig densities, its rotational paddock system, its dispersed manure handling, and its parallel population of geese that disrupted the parasite and pathogen cycles, was a structurally different environment from a transmission standpoint. The geese, although Astrid would not fully understand the mechanism until university researchers documented it in 2016, were consuming the small invertebrate species that served as intermediate hosts for some of the parasites that compromised pig immune systems. The geese were also, through their constant grazing pattern, breaking down the standing fecal matter in the pasture more rapidly than would have occurred in a pig-only operation. The combined effect was that the Kjellberg operation in May 2014 had a measurable immunological advantage that none of the conventional confinement operations in Vernon County possessed. The first sign that something was different at the Kjellberg farm came on April 22, 2014, 3 weeks after the first reported PEDV outbreak in the county. A neighbor named Esther Sandberg, 71 years old, who lived on a small dairy farm 3 miles east of the Kjellberg property, drove to Astrid's farmhouse without an appointment on a Tuesday afternoon. She knocked on the screen door. Astrid answered. "Astrid," said Esther. "Esther, may I ask you a question?" "Yes. Have you heard about the disease that is hitting the pig farms in the county?" "I have heard." "Have any of your pigs gotten sick?" "None of them." Esther was quiet for a long moment. Astrid. "Yes, Esther. Why do you think that is?" Astrid considered the question. She did not want to claim more than she could prove. "The honest answer is that I do not yet know for certain. The system I am running is different from the confinement systems that are getting hit. There is documented research from Europe that geese in rotation with pigs disrupt some of the disease transmission patterns. I cannot prove that my geese are the reason my pigs are healthy, but I am keeping records of what is happening, and I am willing to talk with anyone in the county who wants to look at what we are doing." Esther nodded. "May I tell people that?" "You may. I am not selling anything. I am not asking anyone to convert their operations. I am running my farm. Anyone who wants to see what I am doing is welcome to come out." Esther drove home. She told 12 people across the following week. The first conventional farmer to drive to the Kjellberg property in the wake of the PEDV outbreak was Wendell Mickelson, the 70-year-old neighbor who had encountered Astrid at the Viroqua post office 3 years earlier. Wendell arrived on the afternoon of May 1st. He walked the pastures with Astrid and Henrik for 2 hours. He asked careful technical questions. He listened to the answers. He did not, during the visit, mention the conversation at the post office in April 2011. He thanked Astrid at the end of the visit. He drove home. He called 4 other conventional farmers in the county that evening. The second visitor was a 58-year-old organic dairy farmer from Cashton named Robert Lindstrom, who arrived on May 4th. The third was a 44-year-old conventional pork producer named Carl Wendt, who arrived on May 7th with his 19-year-old son, both of them visibly shaken from the loss of approximately 1,200 pigs at the Wendt operation over the previous 3 weeks. The fourth was Dale Hutchins. Dale Hutchins arrived at the Kjellberg farmhouse on the morning of May 12, 2014, 5 days after he had finished disposing of the last of the 1,700 Yorkshire pigs that had died at his operation across the previous month. He had not slept more than 4 hours per night in the previous 14 days. He had aged visibly in 3 weeks. He arrived in a 2011 Chevrolet pickup. He parked in the driveway. He sat in the truck for 11 minutes. Astrid saw him from the kitchen window. She waited. He came to the porch. He took off his cap. He held it in his hands. Astrid opened the screen door. "Dale." "Astrid." He paused. "I do not know what to say." "Then do not say anything. May I walk the property?" "You may. Walk it alone. Take as much time as you need. I will be in the kitchen when you come back." Dale Hutchins walked the Kjellberg property for 3 hours. He walked alone. He examined the pastures. He examined the rotational paddock fencing. He examined the goose flock. He examined the pig wallow. He examined the pasture rotation schedule that Astrid had posted on the side of the equipment shed in a clear plastic frame. He took notes in a small notebook he had brought with him. He returned to the farmhouse at 12:30 in the afternoon. Astrid had made lunch. She offered him a sandwich. He accepted. He sat at the kitchen table. He ate the sandwich. He did not speak for 15 minutes. Then he said, "Astrid." "Yes, Dale. I owe you a conversation." "Yes, you do." Dale set down his coffee cup. "In August 2011, at the Vernon County Fair, I stood in front of your display at the commercial exhibition hall with 3 of my friends. I was carrying a beer. I asked you if you were serious. You said you were. I laughed at you. My friends laughed at you. I made a joke about buying your property at fair market value when you went through foreclosure. The joke traveled across the county for 2 years. I know it did. I have lost 1,700 pigs in 3 weeks. The Hutchins farm has been running since my great-grandfather started it in 1908. We are not going to make it through this. The bank has already called me. The operating loan will not be renewed for the 2015 cycle. I'm going to sell off what is left and try to figure out what comes next. Dale. Yes, Astrid. I am sorry. I am not asking you to do anything for me. I am not asking you to forgive me. I am sitting at your kitchen table because I want to look at you in person and tell you that I was wrong, and that the joke I made at the fair was the worst thing I have done in my professional life, and that I am sorry for it. Astrid was quiet for a long moment. She refilled his coffee. Dale. Yes, Astrid, I forgive you. The community was wrong. You were wrong. I knew you would be wrong. I did not know how long it would take you to learn it. 3 years was longer than I expected and shorter than I feared. I'm sorry about your pigs. I'm sorry about your farm. I'm not going to gloat. I'm not going to give interviews about this. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. If you ever want to talk about what comes next, you can call me. Dale Hutchins nodded. He could not speak. He stood up. He walked to the door. He stopped at the door. He turned. Astrid, he said. Yes, the geese. Yes. My grandmother had geese when I was a small boy. She kept them in the yard with the pigs. I had forgotten until I walked the property today. I am sorry. He drove home. The story of Dale Hutchins driving out to apologize to Astrid Kjellberg traveled across Vernon County in the following 2 weeks in the way that important community stories traveled in the driftless area, which was through Esther Sandberg telling 4 friends at the Holy Trinity Lutheran Church coffee hour on Sunday, May 18th. And through Wendell Mickelson mentioning the visit at the Driftless Cafe on the morning of May 20th, and through Astrid herself mentioning nothing about it to anyone for the rest of her life. The community absorbed the story slowly. The community had already begun, by the time Dale's visit was reported, the slow process of adjusting around what the PEDV outbreak had revealed. The conventional pork operations that survived the 2014 outbreak began, across the autumn of 2014 and through 2015, to ask Astrid for consultation on small-scale diversification. By the spring of 2016, 6 conventional Vernon County pork operations had introduced small goose flocks as parallel populations. By 2018, the number had grown to 14. By 2022, the integrated pig and goose system had become a recognized agricultural practice in the Vernon County area, documented in University of Wisconsin Extension publications and discussed at regional driftless agricultural conferences. Astrid Kjellberg did not, across the years between 2014 and 2025, attempt to capitalize on the recognition. She continued the operation at the scale that the Kjellberg property could support. She added approximately 14 acres of additional pasture in 2016. She added a small farm store at the front of the property in 2018 that allowed direct customer pickup of pork and goose products. She kept the operation small enough that she could continue managing it primarily with Henrik and Anders. Henrik Kjellberg returned to the farm full-time after completing his agriculture degree at UW River Falls in 2017. He became the operational manager. He married a young woman from Westby named Lena Solberg in 2019. They had 2 children, a daughter named Birte Kjellberg after Astrid's mother, born in 2021, and a son named Niels Kjellberg after Astrid's grandfather, born in 2023. Anders Kjellberg completed a degree in animal sciences at UW-Madison in 2022 and joined the farm full-time. He continued to manage the goose flock, which had grown by 2025 to approximately 140 birds across 3 breeding groups. Birte Kjellberg, Astrid's mother, lived to see her great-grandchildren named after her and after her father. She died in March 2024 at age 86 in the same Stoughton apartment she had lived in since 2003. The funeral was held at the Lutheran Church in Stoughton on a cold morning in late March. Astrid gave the eulogy. She spoke for 7 minutes. She did not talk about the farm. She did not talk about the geese. She did not talk about the PEDV outbreak. She talked about a small farm in Hjortlund, Denmark, where a young girl had grown up watching her father keep pigs and geese together in a small pasture that had not changed substantially in 3 generations, and where that young girl had carried the memory across the Atlantic in October of 1956 when she had been 19 years old, and where that memory had been waiting, quietly, in the back of an apartment kitchen in Stoughton, Wisconsin, for 55 years, until Astrid had finally walked into the apartment in February of 2011 with the news that she was about to recreate the system. The eulogy ended with a single sentence. My mother carried what no one else in our family had thought to keep. The Kjellberg farm continues in 2025. Astrid is 60 years old. Henrik is 31. Anders is 25. Birta is 4. Niels is 2. The farm runs approximately 38 pigs and 140 geese on 156 acres. The annual gross revenue is approximately $112,000. The community of Vernon County no longer questions the system. The community has, in fact, mostly forgotten that it ever did. The Vernon County Community Agricultural Fair still operates every August. Astrid no longer keeps a display in the commercial exhibition hall. The display has not been necessary since 2015. The wooden sign she painted in August 2011, the sign that read Kjellberg Integrated Pasture Operation, Pigs and Geese, established 2011, tradition since 1934, was preserved in the farm store building. It hung on the wall above the cash register that Henrik used. Below the sign, in a small frame, was a black and white photograph of Niels Brorsen, Astrid's grandfather, standing in his small pasture in Hjortlund in approximately 1948, with 3 pigs and 4 geese visible in the field behind him. The photograph had been brought from Denmark by Birta in October 1956 in a small wooden box that had also contained her mother's wedding ring, a Bible printed in Copenhagen in 1908, and a single letter that her father Niels had written to her in 1955, advising her to consider the small specific practices of the land she was leaving behind, because those practices might one day matter to people who were not yet born. The letter had been written in Danish. Astrid had not read it until she had been 31 years old in 1996, when her mother had finally translated it for her at a kitchen table in Stoughton on a Saturday afternoon, while Henrik had been 2 years old and asleep on the couch in the next room. The letter had been the foundation of everything Astrid had done across the subsequent 29 years. The letter remained, in 2025, in the small wooden box on the shelf above the cash register in the farm store, with the photograph and the wedding ring and the 1908 Bible. The letter, when read by anyone who happened to ask Astrid about its contents, said the things that immigrants tell their daughters when they understand that the daughter is going to a country that does not yet know how to value what the immigrant carries. The letter said, in essence, do not forget the small things. The geese with the pigs are a small thing. They are also, when properly understood, the difference between a community that survives a disease outbreak and a community that does not. Niels Brorsen did not know, in 1955, when he wrote the letter, that there would be a disease called porcine epidemic diarrhea virus that would devastate American conventional pork production in 2014. He did not need to know. He knew only that the small, specific practices of his Danish farm had been refined across multiple generations to handle a wide range of conditions that the next generation might encounter in places his grandfather had never imagined. He knew that the practices would matter somewhere, for someone, eventually. He had written the letter to his 19-year-old daughter to ensure that the carrying continued. The carrying had continued. The carrying had reached, in May of 2014 in the kitchen of a small Wisconsin farmhouse, the moment when a 54-year-old American pork producer named Dale Hutchins, who had laughed at Astrid Kjellberg at the Vernon County Fair in August of 2011, walked into Astrid's kitchen and apologized for the laughter, and walked out understanding that his own grandmother had kept geese with the pigs for the same reasons Niels Brorsen had kept them in Hjortlund, and that the memory had been available the entire time if anyone in his family had been carrying it. The Hutchins family had not been carrying it. The Kjellberg family, through one woman, had been. The geese had remained. The pigs had remained. The Kjellberg farm had remained. Dale Hutchins sold the Hutchins farm in 2017 to a young couple from Madison who converted it to a small-scale integrated pasture operation modeled partly on the Kjellberg system. Dale himself moved into a small house in Viroqua. He worked for 2 years at a feed supply store on Main Street. He died of a heart attack in 2019 at age 61. His widow, Mary Hutchins, who was 58 at the time, took a small bag of Embden goose down to Astrid Kjellberg's farm 3 weeks after Dale's funeral. She left the bag on the porch with a note that said, "Astrid, Dale wanted you to have this. He had been saving it. He had been collecting it from your pasture, from the goose feathers that the wind brought across the property line. He had been keeping it in a box in the garage. I do not know what he was going to do with it. I'm giving it to you because he would have wanted you to have it. Mary." Astrid read the note. She placed the bag of goose down in the wooden box on the shelf above the cash register, next to the 1908 Bible and the photograph of Niels Brorsen. The bag is still there. The work continues. The geese continue. The pigs continue. The Kjellberg family continues. The community of Vernon County continues, in the slow, gradual way communities continue, to absorb what one immigrant grandfather wrote in a letter from Hjortlund in 1955, what his daughter carried across the Atlantic in October of 1956, what his granddaughter recreated in Vernon County in March of 2011, and what one outbreak of porcine epidemic diarrhea virus in the spring of 2014 finally made visible to a community that had not been able to see it for the previous 3 years. The seeing was complete. The work continues. That is the only answer the Kjellberg family ever needed to the question that Dale Hutchins had asked Astrid at the 2011 fair, when he had laughed in front of 3 friends in a beer tent full of strangers, and had asked her if she was serious. The answer had been complete in May of 2014. The answer remains complete in 2025. The geese with the pigs remain the answer. They will remain the answer for as long as the family is willing to keep them, which appears in 2025 to be indefinitely.